Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, Leading into the Future. My name is Julie Rowlett, and I'm the Higher Education Partnership Manager for ILM. The last few years have no doubt presented us with unprecedented change, which has really impacted on the way that leaders lead and manage their people. And certainly over this period, practices have emerged because of the very situation that we were in. A key consideration for leaders now is the extent to which we simply revert back to the way we were doing things before, or how do we take the very best of those leadership behaviours that have emerged during the pandemic and embed them going forward. I'm delighted to welcome our experts on this subject who've been extensively researching this topic. So if I can introduce you to Professor Carol Jarvis and Jane Hadfield, who will now do some introductions. Carol, could I ask you just to give an introduction to yourself, please? Oh, Carol, you seem to be on mute. Thank you.
There's always one, isn't there?
Yeah.
Hopefully I've got it out of the way now. Anyway, thanks very much, Julie. My name's Carol Jarvis, and I'm Professor in Knowledge Exchange and Innovation at the Bristol Business School at the University of the West of England. And my learning, teaching, research are mostly around leadership development, coaching and mentoring, and my focus, I guess, is on the everyday experience of working and leading in organisations. So that's where my work on leadership came from.
Great, thank you very much, Carol. And Jane, could I ask you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Julie. I'm not on mute, am I?
No.
So I'm Jane Hadfield. I'm currently working with Health Education England as a national senior programme manager on widening participation and apprenticeships. But my background is NHS from an acute trust background. And I have a clinical background as well. I'm a nurse as well as an OD specialist. And I've worked with Carol and the team at University of West of England for many years in leadership development. I'm also a coach, and we've worked on various aspects of clinical leadership, organisation development, coaching and mentoring over a number of years. And we sort of conjoined that across our programme working together, and we continue to do that.
Brilliant, thank you very much both. Now, Carol, I know you've been doing some research on a book about unleadership. Can you explain what the term unleadership means and how this line of research came about?
Yes, certainly. So I guess the seed for our work on leadership actually started at the beginning of the pandemic, and I was working with a couple of colleagues, Selen Cars and Hugo Gaggiotti, on a couple of projects, and we were doing fieldwork in various organisations and running leadership programs, etc. And all of a sudden, everything went online, and we had to kind of completely rethink how we were approaching our work. And I guess, like many of the people who are probably listening to this, we had formal agendas for our new online meetings that were all about how we're going to rescue this project, what are we going to do, how are we going to react. But before we got started on the main topic, we were checking in with each other, and we were kind of all wondering what the heck is going on here, and sharing stories about things that we'd seen happening locally, and in the media, the stories that we were reading. And so really what we suddenly kind of thought, well, hang on a minute, I can't even remember exactly how it came about, but we started noticing that what was happening, given our interest in what goes on every day in organisations and work, what we started noticing that a lot of the formal political leaders from right across the world, there are some notable exceptions, but by and large, they were kind of dithering, pirouetting, kind of really struggling to make up, to decide what to do and how to react to what was this kind of rapidly became a global pandemic. But while they were doing that, what we noticed was that leadership and actions were happening from very unexpected places. You know, there were community groups, organisations that were just picking up the mantle, if you like, and really sort of starting to think about, hang on, we've got this crisis on our hands, what are we going to do about it, and not just sitting back. So I guess and those things they went beyond kind of just being good neighbours. There were people kind of figuring out how to make PPE, personal protective equipment, for example, and 3D printing it. There were chefs who were now working from home, who were delivering meals to people, to people, and working from their home kitchens and things. Just all kinds of, just really making the best use of whatever resources they had available to them. So we kind of, the actions they were taking, they weren't particularly planned, but they were really creative, and they were kind of informed, and just making, wanting to make this difference, want to make a contribution. And when we stopped and thought about it, we were kind of all had stories about stuff like this that was going on all the time before the pandemic. So we're not saying that this was stuff that was completely new and only coming about because of the pandemic, but it was much more came to the foreground. So we named them unleadership because we didn't want to say that they implied a lack or an absence of leadership, but because they sort of disrupted our ideas about where leadership comes from and what leadership is. And so, we were thinking about, for example, they weren't waiting for people to follow them, so we couldn't really describe it as unleadership in that, as leadership in that sense, because it sort of disrupted all these ideas about how leadership might emerge. So that was kind of where the whole thing came from in the first place.
Brilliant, great, thank you. And Jane, is this your experience? I mean, I think both during COVID and the recovery, and have these leadership practices continued, or have they changed?
It's interesting. It's 24th of March, and 3 years to the day is the date that we pivoted to being home working wherever we possibly could, apart from people who were on the front line. And my role at the time was as a national program manager, with a lot of travelling and going out to visit NHS organisation, trusts, hospitals, practices, and all of that stopped overnight. So on a very personal level, with my direct team, we had to completely change how we worked, and that's definitely remained. Some of that's remained. We started doing more of that outreach work, but we also, the scale and reach of working in a virtual space has been remarkable. And one of the things that, and I've said this to Carol, that as a leader and manager of my own team, the dynamics within my team have definitely changed. So during the time when we were working like this, some of what Carol's just described around the dynamic in a meeting having some formal structure, but in a different kind of structure that was really brought from what people wanted to bring, not just to the table, but to the screen, and to ask them to hold the space together, with also a very strong desire to outreach to people, to hear everybody's voice, and to make sure that we had an opportunity, even in a virtual space, to check in on people's well-being and how they were feeling. In a time of really rapid change, and that doesn't always suit everybody, and trying to kind of make sure that people are comfortable with the technology and that kind of thing. So that's on a very personal level. And then there's something about some of the things that Carol was saying there, that we were managing from my virtual space as virtual outreach to support others on the front line doing what they needed to do and relieving some of the pressure on them as much as we could, so that they could optimize their time. So one of my key roles is supporting apprentices in the NHS, and we wanted to make sure that we kept them on programme, but a lot of them were redeployed and seconded into different work areas. So we had to work directly with them and allow them to lead where we could take their program, and to support their training providers in that. So normally you'd expect a training provider to be quite directive about what the learner was doing, but this had to come from the learner. So it became, I think it is a description of a different kind of relationship, distributed power, a different kind of dynamic and influence, even in that kind of place. So one of the things that I think that I still remark on, we've largely kept quite a lot of the positive outputs of that, certainly in my own sphere. And what I observe is that we use technology to maintain that more distributed and collective way of working, because my experience is it enables a more, what I would describe as a democratic and more systemic way of reaching people and including people. And one of the things that we have mutual interest in is supporting people in a state of unknowing during change. So they don't really know what's happening in the moment, and certainly not what's happening next. And a lot of what we do is working in a change and innovation space. So the learning from COVID we can bring forward about supporting people in that safe space, in a state of unknowing, and allowing them to contribute at whatever level they need to come in at. And one of the small examples is, how comfortable are you about having a camera on or off? How are you going to manage to make sure, if you're chairing an online meeting, that you do include everybody, that you're using the chat function, that you're noticing when someone isn't contributing or hasn't logged on, and what you're going to do about that. So that there's all, as a leader and manager, there's different behaviours that we have to adopt that maybe we wouldn't have to do in face-to-face situations, because we don't have the water cooler moments or the corridor meeting after the meeting opportunities. So it's about topping and tailing meetings. It's about noticing. It's about allowing time and space in a safe environment, both in the virtual world. But actually, some of that learning I've certainly taken into my physical meeting spaces. So we try and maintain some of that behaviours in the physical meeting spaces as well. So I think it's, I'd say there's quite a lot persists, and we see new ways of using collaborative platforms, digital solutions, and I always describe it as ways of ensuring people find their voice, and also noticing different entry levels for people to contribute with whatever the team dynamic, whether it's in a virtual space or in a more collective face-to-face space.
Brilliant, great. Thank you very much, Jane. Now, Carol, can you talk us through the 4 dimensions of leadership that you've identified? Oh, you seem to be on mute again, Carol.
I'm trying to be good, you see, and then I forget. But anyway, so we came across, or we undertook, after those original observations that I talked about, we undertook a more kind of rigorous analysis of what was happening in the media. We ran a number of workshops around the themes to test them out, and we've done a number of interviews with people who are working in organisations who are working in this sort of space. So from that, we uncovered 4 dimensions, and we called them confident, collaborating and connecting, catching the wave, living with the unknown, and paying it forward. So I'm not saying all of these are always present in all of these actions, or that they're the only things that are present. So one of the things we say about leadership is it's more about set of practices, and it varies. How they come into being varies from context to context, and as you might expect. So we've been very careful not to make this something that's like a how to do on leadership, but it's much more kind of open and flexible than that. But so I think that's kind of probably a good place to start. But if I talk about those 4 dimensions, I guess the confident, connecting and collaborating, what we noticed with a lot of our own leaders was that they didn't typically set out to generate followers. They might attract them, and quite often they had a significant impact and people followed in behind them, but that wasn't what they set out to do, and they had the courage to act into the unknown, and before they'd actually secured commitment from other people. And also that then when they reached the end of their kind of area of expertise, or their resources were exhausted, they were quite happy to pass the baton on to other people and to let others pick up and move the initiative forward. So, I mean, I guess one of the places where we saw lots of examples around that for some reason, I guess, was in sports, and particularly around football clubs. So, very much these are organisations that are part of their communities. And there was actually an example that was of an organisation set up before the pandemic called Fan Supporting Food Banks, which was set up by 3 friends who were Liverpool and Everton supporters. Kind of quite an interesting thing in its own right that they set something up, and they said, the part of Liverpool those 2 grounds are in is quite a deprived area, and so they encouraged fans to bring food to matches. It spread quite a lot. It grew from having a couple of wheelie bins outside the ground to having a van, and they're now supplying about 40% of the food to the North Liverpool food banks. But what was interesting, I think, was kind of, just how it played out in little things. So like when they got their van, the van's purple, which is a mixture of blue and red, the 2 colours. The first thing it started being picked up by other clubs. They also started fans taking food to away matches and other grounds. And then when the pandemic hit, what was really interesting was they thought, well, actually, we've got these logistics, we've got these things in place, and they actually set up a hub to bring in together and to connect in with people who are making PPE, delivering food to things, and they worked with the clubs to kind of make that happen. So I think those kind of that willingness to, when they set out, it was just 3 friends thinking we'll kind of collect a few tins, and it's gone off into all sorts of other directions now. And in fact, like Liverpool became the first city to have a right to food campaign. That's all things that nobody would have predicted when it started out. So I think those were the kinds of things that we were seeing happening. In terms of the sort of catching the wave, a lot of that's about Jane talked really well about this in terms of that paying attention, and through that paying close attention to what's happening, how people are, what's going on for them and in their worlds, that we can actually start then to take those timely actions, because we've noticed what's happening. We're not postponing taking a decision till we have all of the information that we could possibly ever want to have. So that meant that sometimes those actions will be imperfect, and actually we embrace that. And when we recognize that maybe the risk of doing nothing is greater than the risk of doing something that's not exactly right. And again, as Jane mentioned, that kind of hooks into a lot of the stuff that we know about innovation, where we say if you're still doing the same thing 2 years later. You waited too late before you started it. So that willingness to take requisite risks, not to kind of, but to use the resources you've got, to think about how I can use those resources, and then that bringing in others when your resources, so you're not kind of necessarily, you're not risking your business, but you are willing to make yourself a little bit vulnerable and say, well, I might not get this exactly right. And I guess one of the examples of that probably everybody in the UK at least will be familiar with is the Captain Tom, the sort of setting off to do 100 laps of his garden, and ending up raising, I think it was well over £30 million for NHS charities together. But the one that really stood out for me was, like, he's on the BBC, and was it Michael Ball that he recorded the "You'll Never Walk Alone" song with? He'd never sung in his life. He didn't worry that he couldn't sing, but if this was something that was actually going to take us somewhere and he could make a difference, then he'd make himself vulnerable and do those things. And obviously, we talked about that was the taking the timely action, but then we all live, and I think the pandemic was extreme, but how many of us ever know in our organizations exactly how things are going to be tomorrow? So once we've actually taken that timely action, we've also got to think about, how do we stay there? What does it take, not just to survive, but to thrive and to be comfortable in that space of the unknown, the unpredictability, the uncertainty. So it doesn't go away. It's always present. And what we found was that, and this is probably something that's going to be quite, it's not always easy in an organization, but these people were driven by a sense of purpose, and the purpose was not necessarily attached to clear goals and objectives. It was more about what is it we want to achieve, who is it we want to be, what do we want to do. And I think that is something that organizations can perhaps take forward in. So it's about not necessarily having a grand plan. But the grand plan is kind of, and I think it's really important in uncertain times, because the further we get into the future, the harder it is to know exactly what's going to happen. So that sort of willingness to have this kind of clear beacon of light at the end of it that guides our actions, but we don't exactly know the path that we're going to have to take to get there. But we're if we know what that is, and we've got that sort of shared understanding of what it is, that it makes the unpredictability and the uncertainty and the unknown a bit easier to work with. And I guess then the fourth dimension, we called it paying it forward, which again, another term that's quite common in the innovation literature. But I think here, whereas when we're looking at innovation and things, we're tending to think about what's the innovation infrastructure. And the ecosystem. This was much more about, what can I put, if I put stuff in, if enough of us put good stuff in, there'll be a bigger pool of good stuff. And these were often tiny acts. I was really interested in what Jane said about, like the checking in with people. So we had people in our workshops, the one that stayed with me, who knew some of her staff was struggling a bit, and she said, we can't have those water cooler conversations that we normally would. So she got little pink jiffy bags and put things like a bag of sweets or something very tiny in them, and just posted them to people regularly, so that they were getting something nice, and they knew that people were thinking, somebody was thinking about them. It didn't have to be a big thing. So these acts are often quite small acts of kindness, but they're about not expecting to get something directly back in return, but rather to just make the best contribution that you can in your current circumstances. And I guess they all kind of connect with each other in that sort of sense, because it is, again, that helps with my action might be a little bit imperfect, but it doesn't matter because I'm doing the best I can. So it's also about being kind to yourself as well as to others. And yeah, so I think that was kind of probably where, a little bit at least about the 4 dimensions.
Fabulous. Thanks very much, Carol. That was really, I think, really brought that to life in terms of the examples that you shared there. Can you give us some practical examples from the research of how organisations have been implementing the dimensions?
Yeah. So I think, as I said before, there isn't really one way to practice it. So the examples that I give are the sort of acts and practices that we've seen, rather than saying, oh, this will work in any organisational environment, because it does vary so much according to the context. But I guess there's a small organisation I want to start with called As Creatives, and they provide creative experiential learning experiences to schools. So the sort of kind of things that are designed to engage students with the curriculum in kind of innovative ways in order to deepen their learning. So the 4 founders are all from the creative industries. There's an actor, there's a poet, so that kind of really sort of trying to bring that into schools. And before they started, they'd all had those kind of successful careers in the arts and cultural industries, and they've brought some of that creativity and spontaneity into the way that they organise. So they don't follow a leadership model. They started off having job titles, for example, and then they ditched the job titles because what they found was that wasn't how they worked together. And then if they gave the responsibility, and maybe you can't do this in a larger organisation, but for them, what it enabled them to do was to say, actually, we can all contribute in our different ways. So they just now all call themselves, they're all still called directors, but they don't have those kind of specific roles, or they have them informally. They know who takes the lead on things, but it created the space for the others to kind of come in and do something if that was appropriate. But what they have got is a very, very clear sense of purpose, and they refer to it as their beating heart. And that's understanding that we're here to try and make children's lives better. So when the unexpected happens, then what they can do is they can respond quickly and effectively, because what they check back on, how does that fit with our goal? How's this going to make children's lives better? And I think when we were interviewing them, they said, well, actually, when the unexpected happens, there might be forks in the road, there might be different ways to go, but we're all going in the same direction, because we've got that sort of, we've got that guiding light, if you like, the beating heart of knowing what it is we're doing. And I think beyond catching the wave, what that helped them with is it helps them to live with the unknown, and it supports the relationships that they've built with schools, because it informs how they are. So there's a consistency in their behaviours, if you like, and the way that they perform in those kind of relationships. So when the schools closed during the pandemic, and given that what they do is go out to schools and give and run sessions, they suddenly had no income. But what they did was they turned their attention to making digital resources, and they could consult with those schools that they've built those relationships with over the years, and find out what they wanted from a digital resource. And then they checked in with them regularly when they were developing it, and they offered teachers workshops and trained them in how to work with the digital resources, because obviously they weren't necessarily present while they were being worked with. And they very early on, in line with their kind of idea about beating heart, they recognised that parents weren't, now kids were at home and they were being homeschooled. And so they put together a package of family resources that kind of was set in a home sort of environment, and they made that available free of charge on their website. And a lot of the teachers were sending it on to the children as kind of more as learning resources. And I kind of, it wasn't what they set out to do, but what they got back in return from that is feedback on how kids were engaging with them, that now has helped them to develop their online resources and make them better. So I think that, that for me, that was another one. There was another example, an organisation that was formed by an existing fashion company called Lost Stock. And basically what they realized was that when the pandemic hit, a lot of the big fashion retailers cancelled their orders with Bangladesh. And in many cases, there was about £2 billion worth of stock that had already been made, ready to be delivered, and wasn't used. And they worked with the factories locally to cut out the labels, rebrand it. They put together packages. You didn't know what you were going to get. You could kind of specify a size and a color range and whether you wanted patterns or plain, but that was about it. And they put together these packs that you were guaranteed to, like lucky dip, I guess, but you were guaranteed to get sort of the equivalent of £70 plus worth of things for 30, I think it's about £40, something like that. And that got the people who'd been laid off in Bangladesh, some of them were coming back, but also the money that they got from that, then went into feeding the families. So it was kind of actually saying, what we've got is we've got this online fashion business, we've got some customers, we know how to get media coverage and things like this. And it was very imperfect. And they owned up and they said, they took much longer because it took off more quickly than they'd expected. It took longer to get, but they put their hands up and said, actually, we're doing the best we can in the circumstances. And I thought that was quite an interesting example. So again, thinking differently about what are the resources we've got available, how can we actually contribute, and then I think it's also that we found that this sense of purpose that I've talked a lot about is often also linked to a sense of place. And to communities or communityship. So the quality of those relationships is really, really important, and holding spaces open. And I think, Jane, again, you sort of alluded to this earlier, but holding the spaces open that allow different voices to come into the conversation, and having those conversations in a spirit of inquiry, reflecting on the different contributions that people bring when they're tackling complex issues. So, for example, what Collective Leadership for Scotland have termed it action confidence, that willingness to imagine what could be and then act to bring it into being, if you like, and bring it into their actions. So in a single organisation, just thinking one big bureaucratic organisation, a couple of relatively junior employees, and it wasn't part of their formal job description, but they set up a series of coffee and catch-up sessions that people from across the organisations, many of them much more senior than they are invited to drop in and join conversations about what it means in their organisation and in their different areas to bring the organisation's values into their practice. And they could bring an issue that they're working on and get input from other people. So it's that sort of action confidence, if you like, to do something without waiting for permission, and just kind of accepting what we're doing isn't necessarily perfect, but it will actually kind of move things forward and start these new conversations and things that would happen. So that, as I say, they're quite often very small, little everyday things. They're not always grand gestures and things that make a massive difference. And I guess, Jane, you'll probably have some really great examples from the health and care sector and find those about that, finding new ways of working together. And you're on mute now.
I put it on mute because the dog was barking. One of the things I think all of our listeners and contributors today and us will know about is the vaccine campaign. And my own experience of that was that there was a huge mobilisation across NHS England and across the whole country around the volunteer workforce. And this really has left a lasting legacy. Now, it's not to say that we haven't had fantastic volunteers in the NHS before, but I think it brought into sharp relief the massive contribution that the volunteer workforce do make and can make and wants to continue to make. And it relates to some of the things you're talking about that really reminded me around the sense of community and that collaboration and the contribution, no matter how small, that everybody makes, that's as valuable as the biggest contribution. So, whether you can only, volunteer an hour a week or whether you volunteer 10 hours a week, that each contribution is as valued as the next. And there are many people who have continued their volunteering journey and have become really instrumental in that. And those of us that have gone through the full COVID vaccine programme, if you go to your local surgery, you'll see that we've still got volunteer marshals and people enacting that. And their roles they're not hidden behind the scenes. They're front and centre. And I think that is something that all of us as service users will have experienced. And it is a change in dynamic, I think, in terms of putting that part of the people who contribute to the NHS at the front. So there's a lasting legacy there, and that continues. And it's allowing some of that sort of recognition, but also observed and seen contribution of people. And I think, so we're talking about volunteers here, but it could also be your support workforce. During COVID, we absolutely saw who our valued key workers were and who were making the contributions, whether it's your Amazon delivery driver, your food delivery driver, or your frontline healthcare assistant, your nurse, your doctor. We absolutely know who the key workers are who are keeping the engine running in the country. So again, I think it is interesting in terms of what's happening, more recently around sort of wider workforce issues that we have in the NHS and perceptions and what is newsworthy. But at the heart of it, it is about recognising the contribution of everybody, again, as I said before, about whatever level they're coming in at, and giving them space to enact, to have a voice, to contribute. And one of the things that I think is another fantastic thing that I've observed, again, not necessarily a new initiative, but possibly more noticed, is the voice of our learners, our students, our apprentices in the NHS and wider in the health and social care sector. And the importance of recognising our learners. During COVID, our learners pivoted again, many of them actually moved from being purely in a learning role to being on the front line and supporting service delivery. And what was really made very obvious is that they are contributing to service delivery and they have a voice. They're both service deliverers and users, and we're all part of that collective. So it it gives more of a platform to make sure that people, again, at whatever level they are, and whether they're in a distributed team or part of a collective team, that they have that voice and it contributes. And we are using, you know, legacy of that around virtual platforms and outreach to make sure that students, again, and apprentices can contribute at any level there. So I think that there are a number of examples, but there are many, many others. And I think one of the things, I've worked for the NHS for a very long time, and service user patient feedback, you know, we're all potentially patient service users, we're carers, we're all of those things. I think it's about what related very strongly to me there is around what you were saying, Carol, about the job title that you have today isn't necessarily describing the full role that you have in the organisation, the team, the collective that you're working in. And, you know, there is some learning here about what we really mean by hearing a voice, whether it's employee voice or learner voice or that. And I think it's behoven on leaders who are building the vision and reaching out to describe with that collective what the shared purpose is. So one of the things for me that's very, very strong in my own leadership journey, and certainly my main portfolio, my national portfolio, is that shared purpose and values, and being really clear about what we're trying to do. And I don't set that vision out alone. You know, you talked about seeding. I think we seed the ingredients for the vision, and we grow it together. You know, it's let's build on the metaphor. You plant the seed, you water the seed, you get the right seed compost, you give it light, you know, warmth. You nurture it. You talk to it. You look after it. You pot it on. And we keep that going, but we can't do that together. So I think it is about, the ethos has to be about the collective and recognizing the potential for development and within those kind of different distributed voices. And I had a conversation with a colleague only this morning about, I think they asked me for feedback on something that they were going to send out, and I gave some feedback, and she came back and said, oh, why didn't I think of that? And I said, that's why we do this thing. We share back and we look at things through different lenses at different levels, through different lenses to the same target audience, but also wider. And that wider ethos of being able to ask for, as a leader, feedback, to take the feedback, to use the feedback, to build on it. I think that is the biggest leadership lesson around the unleadership role. If we can allow ourselves to sit in a place of unleadership, we're more likely to build a lasting vision and be able to build it on the very strong foundation of shared purpose. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, and love the analogy of the seeds in that beautiful room with all your fabulous plants in the back, I have to say. Carol and Jane, where an leadership approach has been taken, can you tell us specifically about the impact that you've seen both in organisations and employees? Jane, would you like to pick up on that?
Yeah, no, I think extending what I was saying just now, I think the big thing for me is, you know, for years in leadership development, and also as a leader, we've talked about collectives, we've talked about social movement, we talk about distributed leadership, we talk about situational leadership, we put labels on all of these things. Actually, I think if we think about the 4 tenets that Carol's described, and we think about occupying a space where actually as a leader you're giving away some of your power, and you're enabling through that ability to hold the space for others, whether you want to call it collective or distributed leadership, whatever. I think that's the approach that this learning gives us. But the focus has to be on the two-way communication and feedback. I mentioned it just now. So in a leadership situation, you know, leaders need to be prepared for hearing things that they might not want to hear. It's not about everybody agreeing with you. It's about check and challenge. It's about learning. Every day is a learning day, as they say, you know, and I think never more so when you have the privilege of leading other people. And I think if we can hold some of those tenets in our space, where we're holding this collective leadership space with others, there's something about the emphasizing that reach in a supportive, trusting environment, and also holding back on judgment. So if someone doesn't agree with us or is challenging, it's about looking through a different lens about what is that challenge about, rather than putting a negative slant on that, because it should be about healthy challenge and that check and challenge in a balanced way. And I think the other thing that is really important, it's about compassion as well, compassionate leadership. So being compassionate doesn't mean not using your power well, or not leading, or not building the vision. It's about walking alongside people. It's about being supportive. It's not about being passive. Compassion is not a passive trait. And Cara mentioned it as well. Leaders need to be compassionate with themselves as well, and make sure they have the right support, the right supervision, and be able to have more of that feedback, both positive and negative, to build into developmental conversations.
I think that
Thank you.
And you've summed that up really well, Jane. And I think for me, as I said earlier, that it's not the unleadership, it's not an absence of leadership. It's maybe paying attention to some of those kind of little small acts, the stuff, I guess I'd call it the glue in the organization, but it's the nurturing, the feeding, and the things that don't get written into our job descriptions typically. So I think that's really important, and I think when you think about it, most of us, we're all human beings, and most human beings are actually genuinely nice, good people. And I think what this is making our workplaces more human. Why would we leave those? Most of us would rather work in an organization that is kind of a difficult word.
Yes.
But compassionate is maybe a better word. And I know that many contemporary HR practices and leadership approaches, and actually ILM's own work on leading through values, really highlighted that where the option exists, many people would tend to prefer working in an organisation that has got that clear sense of purpose, and where they can see how their contributions making a difference. So when we make those spaces for those different voices that don't necessarily mean we're giving away our leadership or our authority, but we're creating space for other people to also act in these more kind of human leaderly ways, then actually it's a benefit to the organisation as well, and to the team and to the individual as well. So it is one of those lovely kind of, to use the jargon, win-win situations that we're creating these spaces where people can, and organisations can, thrive. So that would be my plea. It's not doing away with leadership, but actually also recognising and valuing the things that are the more everyday, that often get a bit taken for granted.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's your turn now, Julie. You're on mute.
We know it's live. And there are some, I think there was just some comments about the screen, and we're hoping everybody can see the screen. I do hope so. I think a couple of people have asked you to state the 4 dimensions again. Carol, if you could just state those 4 dimensions again.
Yes, certainly. So we've called them in no particular order: confident connecting and collaborating, catching the wave, so that the timely, thoughtful action, living with the unknown, and paying it forward, the kind of small acts of kindness that contribute to the greater good. Does that?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, absolutely. And then I think you've possibly covered this. Some people have been asking about how the dimensions of increased leadership effectiveness and how it relates to the world of work. But I think those are questions coming in earlier. So I think you've quite possibly covered off all of those now. So, and I think that's probably it really in terms of the questions that we have there. So I would just really like to say, you know, thank you very much for both of you for joining us today. It's been really insightful to learn. And I know in some respects, Carol, you said at the start, not necessarily all brand new thoughts and brand new concepts, but I think in some respects, the situation we were in and the research that you've done has really brought that to the fore and really helped us to think about this, because of course the way we work, I guess, you know, I'm sat here in my loft waiting for the dog to come up, we'll never return back to the ways that we did before. So certainly it's about how leaders can take these emerging behaviours, these, you know, things that may be there in much smaller pockets, and I guess for the better of organisations and culture, take them forward. So thank you very much. And just a point to note for anybody that's interested, Carol and her colleagues have been working on this research and turning it indeed into a book on leadership. So to give credit both to Carol and Hugo Gaiotti and Selling Cars, and we should expect the book on leadership out in the autumn. So thank you very much to you both. And as usual, in terms of our ILM events, the recording of this will follow up in a few days with the usual feedback forms. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at other events going forward. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks anyone.
Thank you.